Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm extremely happy to be here, and usually I find high schoolers the best audiences, and I expect you to be even better. And congratulations for having nearly finished this quite a feat. Congratulations for the organizers as well, but especially to everyone who has been competing here. Now, in my work as a philosopher of science, I have spent a lot of time studying the notion of objectivity, especially in science, but also in other areas of society, in areas of society where we demand objectivity, such as justice or public policy, and so on. But therefore, when the local organizers here, and Ilmari here, asked me to give this talk at the International Philosophy Olympiad, and he told me that the theme would be democracy, I immediately started to think about a passage that I had encountered some 15 years ago when I was translating Ian Hacking's Philosopher of Science, his book, The Social Construction of What, into Finnish. And this passage about objectivity and the fight against tyranny, it's a very short passage in the book, but it had piqued my curiosity and somehow bothered me, and I had not forgotten it for 15 years. So I thought that this would be the perfect opportunity for me to try to look a bit closer into a question that Hacking raises but doesn't really answer. So in this passage, Hacking addresses an accusation that has been presented many times in many forms. And I'll now show you both a version of the accusation and the passage in question. So, the best formulation of this accusation I have found in Frantz Fanon's book, his post-colonial classic book, Les Dames de la Terre, from 1961. Pour les colonisés, l'objectivité est toujours dirigée contre lui. Or from the 2004 translation of this book, it's been translated twice. For the colonized subject, objectivity is always directed against him. The context of this quotation is that Fanon is talking about journalists writing about the war in Algeria. And these journalists claim to be objective. And Fanon thinks that by trying to be objective, the journalists are in fact on the side of the colonizer. The ways in which they act in order to be objective are in fact dirigés contre le colonisé, so really directed against the colonized subject. So this has been said, a similar claim has been made very many times. So it has been made in different kinds of contexts. In law and courts, absolutely. In science, as we'll see in a moment, or academic research, several times. The idea is that some processes, some behaviors, some decisions are claimed to be objective, but in fact they serve the oppressor. They serve the tyranny. They serve the colonial rule. They serve the patriarchy, whatever we have. Now let's look at the passage from Hacking, which I had not forgotten. The scientist insists that in the end, objectivity has been the last support of the weak. Here is a disagreement. I take this question very seriously, for I am deeply sympathetic to both sides. Some years ago, after a talk of mine about verisimilitude, a freedom fighter of days gone by insisted on the extent to which objective truth is called for as a virtue when one is fighting tyranny. The enemy always tries to steal it. So the freedom fighter here and the scientist claim the opposite to Fanon. The biased journalists, the courts, the biased laws, and biased researchers, they fail to be objective. This is the claim here. They try to steal objectivity. And demanding real objectivity is what the freedom fighter and the defender of the oppressed should be doing. So according to these claims, the notion of objectivity, the ideal of objectivity, seems to be a powerful tool both in the hands of the freedom fighter and in the hands of the oppressor. It can be used to demask oppressing structures in societies, oppressing practices, but it can be also used to enforce colonial rule and tyranny. Now, today, what I'll be doing is that I'll be presenting an analysis of the notion of objectivity that I hope clarifies why this notion can be used for both purposes. So I won't try to define the notion. I don't actually much believe in traditional definitions. Instead, what I'll do is that I'll be looking into the history of the notion and see how it emerged and what this history can tell us. This is a contingent fact. I'm claiming that in the case of this notion, this history can tell us something that is useful when we try to understand the different ways in which we use the notion still today. So while this is very descriptive, I hope that a better understanding of this notion and how it has emerged and what kind of things we are doing when we say that something is or is not objective will help also when we want to counteract ways in which objectivity is used or claims of objectivity are used for oppression. Let's start by looking more closely to the kind of criticism that Fanon presented. To do that, I have here two quotations, and don't worry, I'll read them aloud. One from Edward Said's classic book, Orientalism, still post-colonial stuff, and another from Dipesh Chakrabarty's article, History and the Politics of Recognition. In both of these quotations, the authors focus on research, particularly historical research, and ways in which non-Western and marginalized societies and communities have been represented by historians. Let's look at Said. One would find this kind of procedure less objectionable as political propaganda, which is what it is, of course, were it not accompanied by sermons on the objectivity, the fairness, the impartiality of a real historian, the implication always being that Muslims and Arabs cannot be objective, but that Orientalists like Lewis writing about Muslims and Arabs are, by definition, by training, by the mere fact of their Westernness. Said here is criticizing the way in which Western researchers have represented Middle Eastern societies and Islam as stagnant and never changing, essentially reifying societies and communities, claiming that they are immutable objects of study, which then the outsider historian can tell their essential features. When doing so, these historians, says Said, deny the capabilities of people living in these communities. Now here it's extremely clear that Said doesn't believe for a moment in the claim that this is objectivity. The claim of objectivity is unjustified. That's what Said is saying here. He's saying that this kind of research is political propaganda. This is what the freedom fighter Hacking quoted called sealing objectivity in a clearest possible form. Now, Chakrabarty, in a much more recent paper, as you can see, it's from 2007, draws attention to pretty much the same issue, but from the point of view of a researcher, not of a critic, but of a researcher doing research in history. Now, let's see at the quote. As the struggles of indigenous and other subaltern groups multiply, the various chartings out of political paths and strategies that democratize the world in unforeseen ways, it will become increasingly obvious that historical objectivity is not always to be found on the side of justice, and that the traditional archives of the historians themselves belong to certain relations of privilege. Now, this is a very interesting quotation for me, because here Chakrabarty seems to be wondering which of two possible stances he should take. Is it the historical objectivity, sort of achieved real historical objectivity that is not on the side of justice, that is not on the side of these democratic developments? Or is it in fact the case that what is called historical objectivity and what historians have taken to be ways in which historians can achieve objectivity is in fact it has failed. Historians have failed. What they have taken to be reliable methods for finding ways in finding out about history end up being systematically biased because of the source materials on which they base their work are systematically biased. This would be then reflected in their results, which would then not be objective. So there's a clear tension here. Is it objectivity that is directed against the colonized subject, as Fanon put it? Or is it the case that what has been called historical objectivity is, in fact, not objectivity at all? So which one should we have? Now, feminist critics have presented very, very similar objections to the idea of objectivity. And here I have searched and found a very clear expression of the claim that it's the whole idea and notion of objectivity that is really the problem. Catherine McKinnon takes objectivity to simply mean the objectification of something. So if whoever ends up as the object of study becomes treated as an object, and their agency and their capabilities of changing anything or doing anything actively are denied in this process. So I'll read this. The relationship between objectivity as the stance from which the world is known and the world that is apprehended in this way is the relationship of objectification. Objectivity is the epistemological stance of which objectification is the social process, of which male dominance is the politics, the acted out social practice. So McKinnon just renounces objectivity entirely. This is not an ideal. This is something that is claimed to be worthy, but is in fact just a tool in the hands of the oppressors. Mary Hawkesworth has described very nicely the way in which feminist critics of objectivity see the situation. So under the guise of objectivity, philosophy and science, say the feminist critics, they objectify women, deny their agency, silence their alterity, and condemn them to objectively certified inferiority. The authority of these objective pronouncements then provides the foundation for the exclusion or marginalization of women in culture and society. So McKinnon clearly thinks that this is all there is to the notion of objectivity. There is nothing else. But interestingly, it's also feminist philosophers who claim the opposite. Clear statements that no, objectivity is such a strong ideal that we should not renounce it. Instead, we should embrace it, and we should show that those who have claimed that they are objective have not, in fact, been objective. So I have here a quotation from Sandra Harding. I'll read it. A maximally critical study of scientists and their communities can be done only from the perspective of those whose lives have been marginalized by such communities. Thus, strong objectivity requires that scientists and their communities be integrated into democracy-advancing projects for scientific and epistemological reasons, as well as moral and political ones. I'll explain this. So, Harding here is starting from standpoint epistemology, the view that takes as a starting point the claim that the world looks very different and we know different things about different world. We know different things about the world from different standpoints, from different social locations. So, me, for instance, I'll be looking at the world from the standpoint of a fairly well-off academic researcher. Someone else will be looking at the world from a standpoint of belonging to a marginalized community. Let's say they don't have a job, they may have mental health problems, and they see how the system in Finland that for me seems to be working so nicely and everything is easy to manage has all sorts of flaws and gaps and like features that just make their situation more difficult. And when people who share these kinds of experiences talk with each other and understand that this is systematic, these are systematic flaws in the ways in which our institutions have been built, they gain knowledge, they have knowledge about a society that I don't have. And therefore researchers should strive to collaborate with people in different kinds of marginalized positions in societies in order to gain a better understanding of those societies. So Harding draws a distinction between weak objectivity and strong objectivity. Weak objectivity is something we have within, let's say, a scientific discipline, when everyone or most people in the field agree that yes, here is a claim that we can all accept, it has been reached in a way we find objective, the criteria of objectivity have been met, the criteria we find important, we find the central ones. But to have achieved strong objectivity, this has to be accepted by a much larger audience, so also people from different kinds of standpoints in the society, also including socially marginalized ones, should agree that yes, this is objective. Only then we have strong objectivity. And if science is to strive for objectivity, it should often, particularly in the social sciences, where we're looking at phenomena that have social implications, and where research results will have consequences if they're used in policymaking, for instance, it's extremely important that researchers work in ways that ensure that also those who are in socially marginalized positions in those societies have their words and their viewpoints heard. Only that way they can ensure that their research results are objective in the strong sense. So, as Harding points out, this means that striving for strong objectivity means striving for democracy, because having the voices of also the oppressed heard is striving for democracy. Now, or actually I'll still keep that. How does the notion of objectivity, as I said, I'll be talking about how is this possible? How does the notion of objectivity lend itself both to the kind of use the critics point out, which we can't just dismiss? It's clear that the notion of objectivity and claims for objectivity have been used exactly, or are being used exactly in the ways in which the post-colonial and feminist critics point out. And still, Harding can really convincingly here use it in the way she does. Now I'll try to clarify how these different usages are possible by focusing on the notion of itself. So it's a notoriously complex notion. If you look a bit into the different texts philosophers and philosophers of science have been writing about the different meanings of objectivity, you soon find out that no one agrees, and the only thing people somewhat agree on, though I don't agree on that, is that it's so heterogeneous that it doesn't really seem to have a fixed meaning at all. So to clarify this, I'll present a descriptive account of how the notion emerged and a descriptive account of how I claim we are still using, mostly. In most cases, when we use this notion, we are using it in this way. To start, it's really important to realize that this is a surprisingly young notion. So, Lauren Daston and Peter Gallison in 2007 wrote an absolutely marvelous book titled Objectivity, where they trace the surprisingly short history of the notion. They look at particularly ideas about what makes a scientific representation in the form of a picture in an atlas, what makes such a representation objective. What they argue is that the notion is post-Kantian. It really only emerged in the 19th century. So it first emerged in the mid-19th century, and in a matter of decades became established not only as a scientific norm, but also as a set of practices. So it emerged when Kantian ideas of human subjects became widely understood and partly misunderstood. So post-Kantian subjectivity, Daston and Galison claim, presumes an individualized, unified self organized around the will. So subject is not this passive recipient of impressions, as had been previously thought. Instead, it's something that actively shapes the world around it. Those who deploy post-Kantian notions of objectivity and subjectivity had discovered a new kind of epistemological malady. So the worry is that scientists might be unwittingly distorting things. Because the human subject is, if it's this willful thing that sees what it wants to see and shapes its perceptions and its ideas, this may not be something that the person in question is aware of. So, starting in the mid-19th century, men of science, and it was really men in that time, began to fret openly about a new kind of obstacle to knowledge, themselves. Their fear was that the subjective self was prone to prettify, idealize, and in the worst case, regularize observations to fit theoretical expectations, to see what they hoped to see. So the idea that science might be just wishful thinking suddenly became really worrisome. As Daston and Galison point out, this kind of a worry emerged largely in science, but very quickly we see that a similar worry emerges in law, in courts, in jurisprudence, in journalism. Galison has actually written on that, how the idea of objectivity emerged in journalism and public policy, in the various spheres where we still today want objectivity. In those situations, in those institutions where we want it. Now, Daston and Galison trace in their book, which I really recommend, it's a wonderful read, they trace the emergence of this idea and how people reacted to it. So the first reaction was really thanks to the fact that this was also the era when technological advancements were quite significant. So, for instance, we can't trust human perception because it might be so very misleading. So, instead, we should trust on cameras. We can now take pictures. We can trust on microscopes. We can trust on these various mechanical tools we've developed. So, let's try to remove the human from the whole process entirely. This soon became extremely clear that this is not possible. This is just not feasible. You can't remove the human from the production of scientific knowledge. And also, scientists knew that the equipment they were using also produced certain, like even systematic biases, distortions, for instance. They'd know that photographs taken in a certain way would be distorted in a certain way. Were they not allowed to correct those distortions? So an objection to this idea of mechanical objectivity arose very quickly. We should trust the trained judgment of scientists. It's important that it's trained, so it's not individual subjectivity that's just imposes itself on research, but scientists are trained collectively so that they are able to control the ways in which they might be distorting things. So right from the start, the discussion about objectivity, as we understand it today, has been a discussion about the worry that we as human subjects or agents, individually or collectively, lately particularly collectively, might be distorting or biasing things. So this is an epistemic worry, clearly. But it's also actually a moral worry. So A biased judge is not just epistemically, but also morally questionable. In the role of a judge, their moral duty is to make sure that they don't fail epistemically. So in many cases, it's the moral obligation and the epistemic obligation that are intertwined when we express worries about objectivity. Scientists must ensure it's their duty, it's their moral duty, to ensure that it's not wishful thinking they're presenting as research results. If they fail to ensure this, then we find them blameworthy and morally blameworthy. This is also, this post-Kantian worry that Dustin and Gallison analyze has also led to two very recognizable positions. One of them is pessimistic. There's no way of controlling the human agent, or human subject, even less ways of controlling the ways in which we might be collectively biased. So we can't have objectivity. The other is much more optimistic. No, we can find ways in which we can ensure that we are not biased, which we can ensure that we are not distorting things, and we can develop strategies for ensuring this. Such strategies, typically they include, well, as in the case of mechanical objectivity, removing the subject from the equation as far as possible. So developing mechanistic ways of doing things, developing standard procedures of doing things, so that at least the individual subject cannot distort things when they are just following the procedure in each case. This is like a policy, like a civil servant making a decision will be expected to follow standard protocol, and that's precisely to ensure that their own personal biases, their own personal values will not be leading to unfair decisions. So disinterestedness, also, you should not even have people who are interested, who have something personal at stake doing research or making the decisions. Taking distance in various ways. All these typical ways of ensuring that the willful human subject will not taint the result or the decision being made have also been criticized. They may mask biases. For instance, claiming to be disinterested might just mask the fact that the disinterested person has so-called disinterested person has so completely accepted the values that are the values of the ones who have power in their society, that they don't see how their research is in fact reflecting those values, and therefore unfair to those who don't share them or who suffer from them. What I suggest is that at least the vast majority of the uses of the notion today retain this basic idea. We humans are fallible. We are both epistemically and morally fallible in ways that easily escape our own attention, that are very difficult to control. Therefore, we must devise various strategies to counteract the risk that we fail, to counteract the fact that we are both epistemically and morally very imperfect agents. We must devise procedures, we must devise strategies that ensure that this fallibility does not taint or distort our decisions or knowledge claims. So much of our use of the notion today does indeed follow these lines. So either we say that, no, this is not objective because you haven't really taken into account how there is this huge collective bias that is distorting everything, or yes, this is objective, I've followed standard procedure, I've taken care of every possible step in the research process or the decision-making process, that it is done exactly as it should be done to avoid, for instance, my personal opinions affecting things. So this is not wishful thinking, this is what comes out of the process. Now, let's look at these quotations now that I've claimed that this is more or less what we are doing when we use the notion still today. For the colonized subject, objectivity is always directed against him, says Fanon. So now that we have this idea of how we use the notion of objectivity mostly, we can question claims of objectivity. Is the claim of objectivity really justified? Like in the case Fanon talks about, it's journalists during the Algerian War who were being neutral, who were citing both sides in the war equally, so in order to be objective. They claim that this is very important because otherwise they'd let their own values affect the ways in which they report, and that would be biased. So this is a standardized strategy for mitigating certain kinds of biases that arise from our fallibility. But journalistic neutrality is in fact not a very good strategy in many cases for counteracting biases. Because this is kind of a mechanistic journalistic neutrality that they were defending in this case. And it can create falsely balanced reports. It can create a situation that resembles the one of which you've all heard about, where a TV host demands that a scientist come to talk about climate change to a studio discussion, and then they have a climate change denialist as the other participant in the discussion. That is not neutrality. That is biasing things seriously by presenting that as a genuine disagreement in the TV, in this discussion. So, similarly, strategies that have been devised to mitigate certain kinds of risks of failure might not really work that well. They might be able to mitigate one risk, like, for instance, in the case of journalistic neutrality. They might, in fact, be, yes, that would ensure that it's not just the journalist projecting their own values on their report. But it does not ensure that if there is a huge power imbalance, for instance, in the situation of which they are reporting, it does not ensure that the readers will be aware of this, which completely distorts the picture they are giving, or the representation they are giving. So Said says something similar here, but even more poignantly, because he seems to be quite convinced that the historian who is claiming to be objective, I'm following procedure, I'm following the methods, and I have the truth here, is in fact very well aware of the fact that they are not being objective. So you can also hide behind the claim of objectivity if you equate objectivity with the following of certain procedures and standards, standardized practices. If those practices are systematically biased, which they can be, they can work nicely in one context. If a historian working in Finland, for instance, might be perfectly fine with the methods they are using, but if they use the same procedures in a context where, for instance, the source materials in archives are systematically biased, they will end up repeating that bias. Whereas, so in other words, those standards might be much more locally applicable. They might function much more locally than the historian thinks. Now, McKinnon argues that the kind of misusage of the notion and ideal of objectivity is all we have. There is just objectification and oppression. There is no ideal objectivity to be had. She just renounces the whole idea. But Chakrabarty is not so sure about this. So, as I said, this is a very interesting quotation because is it historical objectivity really? Or is it historical objectivity as we've understood it so far, that is leading to bias, that is leading to injustice. Because if it's only historical objectivity, that is this as established methods for ensuring that we are not distorting things in historiography. If it's that, then we might be able to really correct things. We might be able to develop better methods. So there's a possibility that once we've taken the criticism into account and realized that, okay, these ways in which we treat our source materials and interpret our source materials in our own communities, they can't be moved as is to a new situation because the source materials are so different. So we need to find out new ways in which we may unmask the ways in which these materials are systematically biased. And then we might, in fact, increase the objectivity of our research by doing so, by precisely questioning those strategies that were in place in order to ensure objectivity. But the idea is not renouncing objectivity, it's getting better and more objectivity. Now, this is exactly what Harding suggests. When we have a better understanding of what objectivity requires, we have identified more ways in which we are fallible, more ways in which our fallibility distorts things, more ways more issues we need to take into account when we hear when we hear people from various positions in society criticize our work. This can be epistemically useful. This can increase the objectivity of our research. So, if this is so, then Harding is right in saying that advancing democracy and increasing objectivity, strong objectivity, go hand in hand and happen at the same time. Because, well, you are hearing the voices that have mostly been silent and taking them seriously and revising your methods in science or revising the procedures in courts, for instance. A nice example of this kind of a revision has happened in several countries, several settler states, in fact. For instance, I have examples from Canada, where now oral history is accepted as evidence in courts. It's very difficult to use it, and you need to have anthropologists as expert witnesses in order to explain what's going on here. But oral history has to be accepted as evidence in courts, particularly in land right court cases, because before, like the legal systems that existed before the predecessors of the current Canadian legal system, they were all oral. And there were agreements about land usage. And they are recognized as valid agreements. And the only knowledge that remains of those agreements has been transmitted orally, very systematically. So that's a good reason to take it into account, even though there are very strong, and for good reasons, there are very strong rules in courts that prevent the use of hearsay, saying that no, hearsay should not even be accepted as evidence. And hearsay is someone saying that, yes, I heard that person say that that person had said, and so on. And this is exactly how oral history works. Someone has been taught that this is the agreement that our forefathers made a couple of centuries ago, and they have been taught by someone else. So it could be dismissed, but now this practice has been changed, because in the context in question it just doesn't work. It creates more bias than prevents, or it works, that doesn't function in the way it should. It's creating bias, not only preventing bias. So finally, let's return to Hacking's freedom fighter. So he said that he insisted on the extent to which objective truth is called for as a virtue when one is fighting tyranny. something that the enemy always tries to steal, but we should strive for it. Now, I have argued that when we understand better how this very flexible and very multifaceted notion is used, even today, we can more easily argue against unjustified claims for objectivity, and more easily use the notion for advancing or demanding democracy and objectivity. It's easier to make the claim that they go hand in hand. This is because a better understanding of the notion helps us formulate our questions and doubts and criticisms. When someone is claiming that something is objective, say a scientist claims that this result is objective, or I have used the very objective procedure and so you can't doubt this result, this is how things are. Or when a public, like civil servant has made a decision following a procedure, following the standard protocol, and says that, no, this was an objective process. This is the decision. This is the right decision. Has the scientist, for instance, in this case, really recognized all the ways that are relevant in that situation, in which our failings as human beings, our individual and collective failings as human beings, risk distorting their results, their process and their results? Has the judge or the legislature or the civil servant really recognized all the ways in which even the laws might be biased? In a colonial situation, the laws often are biased. So has this been recognized? Do the used methods, the methods the scientist uses, or the procedures the civil servant follows, do they really work as intended, or as they claim they intended? Do they really mitigate the risk of all these biases we are prone to? Or do they actually create new biases, or do they sustain some bias that is something that the ones in power take so much as obvious and that they don't even realize that it's there? So by looking at into the history of this notion, we now can a bit more easily pick out these kinds of questions and show why claims of objectivity can be unjustified. And demand that to actually ensure objectivity, these practices, these standardized, institutionalized practices need to be changed. That is all. Thank you.
Now, we have some time for questions if the audience members want to ask something from Dr. Koskinen. Any questions? Oh.
Thank you. Can we state that something is objective if it is passing through our mind to make a knowledge? Isn't mind changing their object and making only models of real life which are understandable for the human mind?
Yes, okay, we are going very deeply into Kant here. Thank you, that's a very good question. So, as I pointed out, the notion of objectivity we use today, and also Daston and Galison argue, it's not really the Kantian objectivity, it's a post-Kantian objectivity. Kant has a notion of objectivity of his own, which sort of just skirts around that issue. So one worry that is very persistent when we talk about objectivity is that there is a meaning of objectivity that has been contested very many times that says that we have objective knowledge when our knowledge claim corresponds to how things are in the world independent of us. And sure, we can't know that. It's not even perfectly clear whether that kind of an idea makes very much sense. There are criticisms of that idea. But it doesn't mean that, so objectivity does not imply certainty. There is a conceptual distinction that has to be made if we want to have a meaningful notion of objectivity. If it would really imply certainty, if it would imply that, okay, we know now that our representation corresponds perfectly to how things are in the world, independent of us, then we'd just have to say, okay, we can't have objectivity, it's a useless notion. But if we relax that requirement a bit and recognize that in many cases we want more objectivity, and it makes sense to say that we want more objectivity, even though we can't achieve that, and philosophers disagree whether that is something that even makes sense as a goal, we might still say that the judge who adds to the decision-making process, makes a change in the decision-making process to ensure that, for instance, their personal experiences won't distort their judgment, has become more objective. We can develop a research method and say that now we have counteracted the risk of this kind of a distortion. We know that this is a serious risk here, and we have found a way in which we can counteract it. So then we have more objectivity. I really think that what your question points out here is, if we want to have a meaningful notion of objectivity, it has to be a degree notion, and it has to sort of just admit that the kind of perfect corresponding, like our knowledge claims corresponding to the world as it is independent of it, that's not reachable. We can never have proof of having reached that.
Any other questions or comments?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you for the talk. Second thing, okay, so we talked about striving for objectivity, like the idea in of itself, but at the same time, very often we can see that the subjective perspective can be just as useful, if not just as important. So the question is, how should we find a form of balance between subjectivity and objectivity?
Oh, that's a very good question, thank you. I'd say that it completely depends on the case in question. There are many situations where we don't want objectivity. As an example, I've typically used the situation where a friend of ours vents about their recent breakup with their spouse. Are we supposed to be objective there? Is that what's wanted from us? If we want to remain friends with this person, probably not. But there are situations where we standardly want objectivity. We don't want it in art, but we absolutely want it from the civil servant or the judge or the scientists. And it helps, I think, to understand that the ways in which the risks we are facing when we are striving for objectivity depend very much on the context. So the ways in which a judge tries to ensure that their decisions are objective are completely different from the ways in which a scientist working in a laboratory strives to assure that their work is objective. And that's still very different from the ways in which an anthropologist working in the field strives to ensure that their work is objective. The judge has to balance all sorts of different risks, also their personal ones, but also often they need to take into account also, the law may even require that they take into account the individual situations in which the people in question are. So do I send this person to jail, or do I give them just a fine? That might depend on the situation where that person is. In the laboratory, the researcher is supposed to ensure that no personal idiosyncrasies of subjectivities affect the research results, so they're really following procedure very strictly. And in the field, the anthropologist, I think that the most significant bias they must avoid is ethnocentrism. And to do that, once again, the ways in which they do that are completely different. So the role that subjectivity plays in these are also very different. So then I don't think I have a general answer to that, but that needs to be thought about in every situation where you're striving for objectivity. Thank you.
More questions? Yeah, okay.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting, and I was just wondering, what do you do with the notion of truth? Because, I mean, are you saying that there could be different degrees of objectivity, but there is no truth? Or you are saying that there could be sort of different degrees of truth and in the context of post-truth and alternative facts in case of, let's say, Trump's inauguration and things like that? I would like to hear your comment. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question. I suppose Ilkka Niiniluoto spoke to some of you about truth-likeness and post-truth and so on. So I'd say that it's precisely looking at the history of the notion of objectivity that we see how the notion is, yes, it might be, in certain cases, it might be quite closely related to the ideal of truth. But the emphasis when we talk about objectivity is on our failings as human agents, our individual and collective failings as human agents. Truth doesn't have this emphasis on us. Truth is truth. It's not something that would necessarily, that would be related to the fact that we are so fallible. And objectivity, the notion revolves around the worry that we are fallible. So if you, I would say that increasing objectivity in science, when we're talking about truth, will increase perhaps the truth-likeness of the results. But if we're talking about objectivity in a court, it's really not about, a decision is not true or false. It's the right one or the just one, rather than true. Does this answer your question? You look a little bit skeptical. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, please join me in thanking Inkeri Koskinen.